Now, we're continuing a study on the three angels' messages, and in particular right now, we're going to be jumping. I know we spent several weeks talking about Revelation 14:6. We're reaching into verse 7 now. But I'm going to back up and start with verse 6 just to give you the context. Revelation 14:6, "Then I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come, and worship him that made the heaven and the earth and the sea and the springs of water." And so actually in the last week, Pastor Ross talked about the Creator, worshiping the Creator. I'm now delving into the second angel's message, which is beginning with verse 8. "And another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she made all nations drink the wine of the wrath of her fornication." And you get to verse 9, it says, "Then a third angel." All right, so obviously, we had the first angel. Then it says in verse 8, another angel. That's the second angel. Verse 9, third angel. So we see the sequence here. We're just talking about verse 8, which is the second angel's message. But while it looks like one little bitty verse, it's ginormous, as they say. Just to get the second part of that, if you go to Revelation chapter 18 with me, go to Revelation 18, verse 1. This expands on the second angel's message. "After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become the dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her," notice that her, because that is explained earlier, "fornication, wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. For her sins have reached to heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities." And it goes on, and you read all through chapter 18, and it talks about the fall of Babylon. And so much of what you read here in chapter 18 is similar, it parallels with the punishment of Babylon you read about in Jeremiah chapter 50. Remember, 404 verses in Revelation, 278 of those verses can be found almost word for word other places, mostly in the Old Testament. So we've really got to back up and get the whole picture here when it talks about Babylon is fallen. So Babylon is found all the way from Genesis to Revelation in the Bible. If you have your Bibles, you may want to join me in turn. We're going to look at this real quick because you really need to find the first reference of something. Go to Genesis chapter 11. This is something that takes place not too long after the flood, and it kind of lays the groundwork, as they say, for Babylon. "Now the whole earth," Genesis 11:1, "now the whole earth had one language and one speech." And everyone says, what was that language? Was it German? Was it, Spanish? Depends on who you ask. The Spanish insist it was Spanish. It's the language of Canaan. We don't know exactly what it was. We'll be speaking it again in the new earth, I suppose. "And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east," just talking about after the flood, they began to populate. Keep in mind, Noah lived 300 years after the flood. Shem lived 500 years after the flood. Shem's life actually overlapped the life of Abraham by over 100 years. Back when you lived that long, and assuming people were healthy and fertile for 30% of their lives, there was a lot of multiplying happening. Not only did God tell Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply, he told Noah and their descendants, be fruitful and multiply after the flood. And as they began to multiply, you do the math, and there could have been, hundreds of thousands of people at this point. And they migrated down to the plain of Mesopotamia. The soil was rich at that point and very fertile. And with a little bit of farming effort, you could feed vast quantities of people, and you actually had extra time. You notice in the places of the world where they build these great monuments, they also had an abundance of food. Egypt was a breadbasket because of the Nile Delta there. They were able to grow so much food, they were able to employ a lot of slaves to build these great monuments, as with Mexico and the Yucatan Peninsula and places in India. And so here they had an abundance of food, they had a lot of people, and they started getting ideas. Then they said to one another, verse 3, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and they had asphalt for mortar. There was an abundance of clay after the flood. There was a lot of Bermudan and asphalt following the flood. You know, all that vegetation had been quickly buried, and it was now beginning to ferment and ooze up out of the ground. And you got a lot of oil from the country of Iraq. And so to this day, there's abundant asphalt pits, or we call them tar pits. And they were using that for mortar. It actually makes pretty good mortar when you mix it with sand. And they said, "Come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Now, was there anything wrong with what they were wanting to do? I mean, is there a command in the Bible, "Thou shalt not build a city"? In a sense, what had God told them to do? Did he tell them congregate in one spot? Or after the flood, did he say, "Go, spread out, subdue the earth, be fruitful"? He wanted them to go out and enjoy the creation. And they were fearful, you know, we may be weak through numbers. Another thing I've heard is that immediately following the flood, that animals began to also multiply. Some of them were much bigger than what you see in the world today. In a minute, we'll read about Nimrod, the mighty hunter against the Lord. I think you'll read in some versions, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And the reason he had such a reputation is because there were these huge beasts that went forth and began to multiply, and not only large reptiles, but there were some probably very large mammals. We know from fossils, you've seen the woolly mammoths and the saber-toothed tigers, and I've been to museums where they show a moose rack that was like 12 feet across. They have a beaver skeleton that was 10 feet high, a sloth 13 feet tall. I mean, we can't even imagine this. Just enormous, even the mammals. And so they were afraid to go out in the world because the animals also were spreading everywhere. They weren't as afraid of man as they were before the flood. And they needed someone who was a mighty hunter like Nimrod to help give them peace. And they said, "Look, if we build a city, we'll be safe. And just in case we can't trust God," he said, "I'll never flood the world again, but we should probably build a way of escape, have a backup plan." And they're really building this city with a big central monument to it, kind of making a name for themselves. Instead of, you know, God took man, put him in a garden. And here they're taking man and putting him in a city. Cities are often concentrations of problems because cities are full of people, and people unconverted are sinners. So if you've got a concentration of sinners, you're going to have a concentration of problems in your bigger cities. And is that usually true? Only exception will be the New Jerusalem, where everyone's converted. So it seems like the tower is a monument to human pride. They said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." The Bible says they should say, "Hallowed be thy name." They're going to save themselves. It's a monument to salvation by works. Now, this is very important because Babylon then becomes synonymous with man-made religion from Genesis 11 on. So it's very important you catch this right here out of the gate. By the way, the word Babel means gate of heaven or gate of God. Later, the word Babel also came to mean muttering or babbling, which is where you get the word baby. because babies start out babbling. But originally the name, as far as they can tell, it talked about the gate to heaven or gate to God. And so they used to bring their offerings to the gate of Eden. But now they said, we're going to worship on this man-made temple, this tower we're making to save ourselves. It's a monument to man's defiance. God said, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. They said, no, we're going to congregate in one spot. We're going to centralize power among men. And they were to spread out and worship God. It was a monument to human achievement. You know, we're going to make this big tower. And they thought it would be dazzling to the beholders and bring glory to the builders. Biggest building in the world today is in Dubai. Karen and I are going to be in Dubai in a couple months, next month. And that's not our destination, but we're going to preach there once. We're going to India. And I've been there before, and the tallest building in the world now is the Burj Khalifa. It's amazing because you start driving up to Dubai from the airport, and you can see 50 miles away, you can see this building rising up. And it's twice the size of all the other skyscrapers. It's frightening. Well, right now in Saudi Arabia, they've already begun construction on a building that is going to, and the Burj Khalifa is over 2,000 feet. They're building a building called the Jeddah Tower in Saudi Arabia that is going to be over 1,000 feet higher, 3,200 feet. And you can go online and see they've got, the first 1,000 feet built. And things kind of stalled with some corruption, but I'm pretty sure they're going to finish it. It's interesting, men are trying to build higher and higher right now. A little amazing fact, when they built the Empire State Building, when I grew up, that was the tallest building because I was living in New York before they had the World Trade Centers. And King Kong was my hero. So I was very close to the Empire State Building. Karen and I, during Net 99, we stayed in an apartment. And it just happened we were on the 7th floor of this apartment building. And there was a glass skylight. And we looked up at the Empire State Building every night when we went to sleep. But it's interesting. The Empire State Building, they broke records that have never been passed when it came to construction speed, even with their primitive technology back then. At one point, they were building 14 stories in less than a week. Try to do that today. And I think the whole building, from the time they began construction, I think they built it in less than a year. It was pretty fascinating what they were able to do with that. But man just keeps building towers higher and higher. Makes you think about the Tower of Babel. So it was a monument to human achievement. It was a monument to disbelieve in God's word. He said, I will no longer flood the world. They thought maybe they'd climb this tower and save themselves. And it was kind of the monument to man, a man-made heaven. We're going to build utopia on earth. And so Bible says we're to look for a city that has foundations whose builder and maker is God. Our city is not in this world. Moses turned his back on Egypt looking for a better city. Abraham, he was looking for a better inheritance. So Babylon sort of becomes man saving himself, man-made religion, and you see that beginning very early in the Bible. All right, now when we're trying to find out, it says, Babylon has fallen, come out of her, my people. God confounded the languages of Babel. Matter of fact, let's go back to Genesis 11. You maybe never left it, but you never left it. Good for you. So they said, let's build the city. Verse 5. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the sons of men had built. Now, is that because God is saying, I wonder what's going on down there? Or did he know? God said, I've come down, when it came to Sodom, I've come down to see if the cry of it that's come up to us is as bad as they say. Well, God knows everything. He's just saying things on terms, meaning that judgment is imminent because he's really going to investigate the evidence now. And so before judgment came in the days of Noah, Sodom, Babel, it's like the Lord stops and says, I'm going to take a close look at what's going on here. It'll happen again. There's a final judgment just before the Lord returns. And he says here, the Lord came down to see the tower which the sons of men had built. Now, who are the sons of God? Genesis chapter 6, when the sons of God intermarried with the daughters of men, they lost their holiness, and then it says the thoughts of men's hearts were only evil continually. Does it say the Lord's coming down to see what the sons of God are building or what the sons of men are building? That's talking about enos. It means the carnal, earthly people. And the Lord said, verse 6, indeed the people are one, and they all have one language, and this is what they begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us, do you notice the Trinity in here? God is again plural. Let us make man in our image. Come, let us go down and confuse or confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there all over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. You read about this. Question, Terry.
Yeah, there was only 8 of them when it started. How many years was it before it got to this?
All right, let me repeat your question. From the time that Noah and his sons got off the ark, there was only 8 of them. How long was it before this happened? I'm guessing that a couple of 100 years went by, just based upon that. And keep in mind, Noah, Shem, there were still some godly people that probably protested against their building the tower, but they were overruled. And like I said, you hear about Nimrod, the mighty hunter, and the beginning of his city was Babel. You can read in verse 8, chapter 10 of Genesis, verse 8. Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord, and some versions will say against the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod the mighty hunter, and the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. So then it backs up and it gives you more detail about Babel in chapter 11. Evidently in the construction process, and you read about this in Patriarchs and Prophets, they didn't have radios. Very tall tower. We don't know how far along they got, but it may have reached quite a height. They're communicating, send up more tar, send up more brick, whatever, and they suddenly, some accents overcame them. Their speech became garbled. They would talk. They thought they were talking distinctly. Nobody else understood them. We don't know exactly how the Lord did it, but because they were working against God, their languages were confused. Keep in mind, a confusion of tongues is not a sign of God's approval. There are churches today that teach a confusion of tongues is a sign of God's approval. Isn't that right? At Pentecost, God removes the curse. He reverses the curse of Babel. He fills them with the Spirit, all these different language groups that normally would not understand each other. All of a sudden, through the Holy Spirit, they do understand the wonderful works of God. So the idea that God fills you with the Spirit, you start to babble. And where do you get the word Babylon? That is completely the opposite of what I see and what I read in the Bible. And so they got so frustrated they couldn't communicate. They threw up their arms. As a matter of fact, in Patriarchs and Prophets, she said it descended in fights and bloodshed. So those who could sort of understand each other, they banded together and they began to scatter and populate the different corners of the earth. Now, it was also during this time, and I don't want to take this too far, but you got to fill in the pieces. It says, in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. Now we pretty well understand something about tectonic plates and continental shift. Both Christians and evolutionists agree that at one point there was probably a more uniform continent. Not too long after the flood, when things were settling, it seemed like there was this very rapid shift. And the earth masses were moving, and there may have been a lot of earthquakes, and we know there's a ring of volcanoes around the Pacific, and a lot of seismic activity, and the earth was probably thrown off its axis after the flood, and there were, what do you call it, the Great Freeze. The Ice Age. Yeah. Yeah, it's terrible when you get older and can't think of those words. But I had a brain freeze right there. Anyway, and so there's a lot of things happening at this time, but they were scattering. I mean, we know now from DNA studies that the Native Americans, their blood goes back to the people of Mongolia. It's very similar. And they came across, they were right, they came across probably the Bering Strait. You could walk across it back then. And you could probably walk from parts of Polynesia into Australia. And so the whole earth changed in a couple hundred years. There was radical changes. So all this is going on. And then Babylon, a few people probably hung around. They began to inhabit Mesopotamia. You don't hear a lot about Babylon. It sort of became a center of learning. The tower just sat in disrepair. A couple of kings came along to repair it. Now you can read in the writings of the historian Strabo and Herodotus that the Tower of Babel had been repaired by King Nebuchadnezzar and maybe his father before him. And they describe it as just a magnificent. They didn't build it according to the original design, but they had restored it. And they said that there were 8 big squares, something like a Central American or one of the Mexican or Aztec ziggurats that has step pyramid, like King Xosier's step pyramid. You've probably seen that one in Egypt. It's one different from the smooth-sided pyramids. And it says there were 8 layers, except there was a spiral that went around where you could actually ride wagons all the way to the top of this thing. And there was an altar at the top. It was a place of worship. Nebuchadnezzar, in spite of the curse that had happened on the tower, said, I'm going to build it again. And he built it up. And it survived him. History tells us that King Xerxes of Persia, because they did not, the Persians, were not monotheistic. They were not polytheistic. They were monotheistic. And when they overcame the Babylonians, they returned to the worship of one god. They tore down this big monument to one of the many gods of Babylon. And he told them all, take the stones, use the stones for your own buildings, and they pulled it all apart. When Alexander the Great came along, he still saw some of the ruins of the original Tower of Babel. He wanted to build it back up again. And, he died in Babylon not long after that. He drank himself to death and died with a fever. So that's just a quick overview of what was happening with the tower. But Nebuchadnezzar, because of the unfaithfulness of God's people, the Babylonians came and conquered Israel. I mean, they didn't do it in a small way. Babylon conquered Jerusalem. Now, you see this tension happening between God's people. God says, go spread. Abraham leaves Mesopotamia. He goes and does what God says. The other ones congregate and they build and they go into worshiping many gods. You see where Nebuchadnezzar, he's got Babylon, and he comes and he destroys the temple of God in Jerusalem. And then you get to Revelation, you got the New Jerusalem, and you got spiritual Babylon. So you got these 2 opposing cities, these 2 opposing worships that happen. So Nebuchadnezzar, because of the unfaithfulness of God's people back in the days of Jeremiah, his protection, God's protection was withdrawn. Nebuchadnezzar destroys the temple, burns the temple, takes the holy things away, brings them, puts it in the temple of his gods. Remember what happened at Belshazzar's feast in Babylon? And carries away captives like Daniel and his friends and thousands of others. But then after 70 years in Babylon, this is all very important. Understand Revelation. God says, look, I'm going to destroy Babylon because of her sins. And I want my people to go out of Babylon, go back to the promised land. And so when you read in Revelation, Babylon is fallen. Why does it say fallen, fallen? Babylon falls back in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, or his son. Babylon falls again spiritually in the near future. Or actually, Babylon fell spiritually a while ago. But God is calling his people out of Babylon. Problem was, if you went and you're going to stay somewhere for a year, how much would you pack? All right, now you're being told you're going to go stay somewhere for 70 years. How much do you pack?
Everything.
How comfortable do you get in that place? Do you learn the language? Do you make friends? Do you adopt the customs? God told the children of Israel through Jeremiah, you will be in Babylon 70 years. Well, they got so comfortable in Babylon that near the end of Daniel's life, when Babylon fell, you remember handwriting on the wall? God told his people during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, come out of Babylon. come back to the promised land. They're going, well, that was a wonderful teaching that we'd someday go back to Israel, but there's nothing back there now. The walls are broken down, the city's broken down, and there were just a few patriots that said, we're going to go rebuild the Holy Land. We're going to be part of God's plan to build up the foundation of many generations. And they went back. And they struggled. You read Nehemiah. They had their enemies all around them trying to stop rebuilding the city. And so most of the people had gotten so comfortable in Babylon. How was Esther chosen as a queen of Persia? Because Mordecai did not go back to the promised land. He, with Esther and many others, stayed. You remember the king of Persia? He made a law that all the Jews in Persia would be killed. What were they still doing in Persia? They had been told by Cyrus, you can go back to the promised land. They said, no, we like it here. So when God says, Babylon has fallen, come out of her, my people, that you do not receive of her plagues or partake of her sins, the Jews understand an Old Testament scenario there. Now I'm going to make it even more complicated. Later you're going to read about the 7 plagues. Who knows what the 6th plague is? The Euphrates River is dried up to make way for the kings of the east. When Babylon fell, under the leadership of Cyrus, the Persian general, he later became the king, how did Babylon fall? He diverted the Euphrates River into a dry lake bed where it ran under the walls of Babylon. The Babylonians hadn't guarded it. They thought it was an impenetrable barrier. He and his army went tromping up the muddy banks one night, found the inner gates left open. They went in and quickly took the city and killed the king in one night. So knowing the story of what happened in Old Babylon helps you understand what Revelation is talking about. The Jews this was part of their history. They all knew that. So, what is Babylon? Go to Revelation chapter 17, please. And you read here, then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls, 7 vials, he came and he talked with me, saying, come and I'll show you the judgment of the great harlot who sits on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. Now we just read in verse 18 about Babylon committing fornication with the kings of the earth, in chapter 18. And the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast, which was full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. Revelation 12 and 13, you read about a beast with 7 heads and 10 horns. Very similar to a beast you find in Daniel that's also got 10 horns. And so it goes on to say, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and precious stones and pearls, having in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the filthiness of her fornication. And on her forehead a name was written, here it is, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. So God pictures Babylon now as a woman. And who is this woman? Go to the last verse. I'm just going to take away all the suspense by going to the punchline. Go to the last verse of chapter 17. And the woman who you saw is that great city that reigns over the kings of the earth. Revelation 17, verse 18. The woman that you saw is that great city that reigns over the kings of the earth. What city was reigning over the kings of the earth when John wrote Revelation? Rome. What does a woman represent in Bible prophecy? A church. How many guesses do you need to find out who is a woman that sits in Rome that is prominent, that claims to be the mother? The Roman Catholic Church even refers to herself as a mother. Do you know that the Pope is technically a pastor of a congregation? You know, I direct Amazing Facts, but I also pastor a church. You're our church family. The Pope actually, along with being Pope, he's got a local church he's the pastor of. But it's not the Vatican. He's the pastor of the Lateran Church. And if you look on the walls of the Lateran Church, it says, the Mother Church of the World. Right there's a plaque right there at the entrance of it. And so they basically say all the Protestant churches are unfaithful daughters that have come out of the Mother Church. This is what they say. And so look at the descriptions. What do the 7 heads represent? If you look in verse 7, the angel tells John, "Why did you marvel? I will tell you the mystery of the woman and the beast that carries her, that has the 7 heads and the 10 horns. The beast that you saw was and is not, and will ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And those who dwell on the earth will marvel, whose names are not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they see the beast that was and is not and yet is. Here is the mind that has wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 mountains on which the woman sits." So Babylon is known as the city, or I should say Rome is known as the city of 7 hills. And I can't pronounce the Capitoline. There's 7 mountains that you can look up. Just type in 7 hills. You know what it's going to take you on Wikipedia? Rome. Rome is called the Eternal City and the City of 7 Hills, because there's 7 prominent hills that surround it. It says that she's full of names of blasphemy. What is blasphemy? Blasphemy is when you, well, a couple of biblical definitions. You take the prerogatives that belong to God. One definition for blasphemy is when Jesus said that he could forgive sins, he said, "You speak blasphemy." They were going to stone him. And another is when Jesus said to someone, "You are forgiven," and they said, "That's blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins." So this power, for one thing, they say that they have the power to forgive sin, and they take the names of God. Does the Roman Catholic Church claim to have the power? And do they claim, well, let me just read you a quote from Ferris's Ecclesiastical Dictionary. "The Pope is of so great a dignity and so exalted that he's not a mere man, but as it were God, and the vicar of God." And there are several quotes where the Pope actually claims these divine prerogatives. You know that the priests say that they can forgive sin. She says she's dressed in purple and scarlet. The colors of the cardinals is scarlet, and the colors of the bishops is purple. And so you can see that if you see any of the pomp and ceremony. Adorned with gold and precious stones. Did you see Jesus and the apostles walking around with all the bling of the religious bling? I don't know if you've ever been to Rome or you've seen some of the pictures of the ceremonies. It is just, it's gilded all through the Vatican, and there's gold and pearls, and the Catholic Church, I understand, owns more priceless works of art than any other institution in the world. I don't think you find that hard to believe. It says she's called the Mother, and I told you that the right there inscribed on the Pope's church, it says, "The Sacred Lateran Mother and Head of all the churches of the city and the world." Called Mother Church. She's called the harlot. Now, I know that sounds pretty severe, but lest any Catholics that are watching think that we're giving you a hard time, God calls his people a harlot whenever they're unfaithful. Children of Israel, God said to them, "I'm your husband, and you have gone whoring after other gods." I know that's strong language, but that's exactly what the Bible says. Read the book of Hosea, where God tells the prophet to do something very odd that no pastor would want to do. And he says, "I want you to go take a wife of harlotry, because this is what I did. You've been unfaithful to me." So when a church is unfaithful in their doctrines, God calls it harlotry. What would some of those doctrines be? Well, I'll get to that in just a second. It says it's a persecuting power. This woman rules for 42 months in a special way and persecutes other churches. And I think you've seen the studies where, what's that? Oh, we're going through Revelation 17. I just read Revelation 17. Now I'm backing up and I'm highlighting the points I brought out. Okay? It says that she's in power for 42 months, and that's in verse 6. Guilty of the blood of the saints, a persecuting power. And you can read through history of the popes. Great numbers were driven from their habitations of the Protestants and Jews. Wives and children stripped and naked, many inhumanely massacred. Sits among 7 hills that I mentioned to you. Rules over kings of the earth. That means it's a religious political power. Now, what other church has ambassadors from the world? What other Christian church? Does the U.S. have an ambassador to the Southern Baptists, which would be the largest Protestant denomination? Do they have an ambassador to the Presbyterians? They don't have an ambassador to the Church of England, the Episcopalians. There's no other Christian church that is considered an independent country. There's a reason that the Vatican felt very strongly that they should be noted as an independent country, because it gave them access to the political leadership of the world by being listed as a country. It's only 109 acres. It's the smallest country in the world. They got their own currency. I've got some coins that have the Pope's head on them. I was afraid someone's going to catch me with that in my desk. Wonder what's going on. I read online last night that I was a Catholic Jesuit infiltrator. So I assure you, to the best of my knowledge, I'm not. But they've got their own publishing house. They got their own mini railroad. You know, there's a little bitty train that goes from the Vatican to other parts of the town. And so it's an independent country. Isn't it interesting that the Pope calls a meeting and the president of Palestine and the president of Israel fly to the Vatican to talk about peace with the Pope? That's a lot of power. Isn't it interesting that when Pope Francis came to the United States, it was unprecedented. He went to all the places of our political power. He went to New York City, where our seat of government used to be. He went to Philadelphia, where our liberty was signed. He went to Washington, D.C., and he spoke at the United Nations. That's incredibly significant. It says this power has kings over the... Any of you ever play chess? What's next to the king and queen on the right and the left? The bishop. Where did they get that idea? Because all through the Middle Ages, in every palace of Europe, there were church representatives. The ones who finally got tired of that was the French, and that brought about the French Revolution, and they basically turned to atheism because they had become so fed up with the government being manipulated by the church for over 1,000 years. And so there was something that led to that. So it fits that definition. So, and you can see the comparison, the 10 horns in Revelation 17, in Revelation 12, in Revelation 13. And all of the great reformers, Calvin, Luther, Wesley, Spurgeon, John Knox, they all identified the woman in Revelation 17 as what we call today the Roman Catholic Church. Now, I'm not trying to be hard on the Catholics because it says that she has daughters. And it tells us that she's the mother of harlots. Who would the daughters be? Daughters come out of a mother. They share DNA with a mother. And there's usually similarities. Well, a lot of churches came out of Catholicism that retained in their teachings some of the same things. They would be equally unfaithful. And so God is now calling people out of the mother-daughter relationship. Now, while we're talking about that, can you think of another mother-daughter team in the Old Testament that persecuted God's people for 1,260 days? Have you heard of Jezebel? And Jezebel had a daughter named Athaliah. And during the time of Jezebel, there was a famine for 3.5 years. And the prophets of God were persecuted. Some were killed, others hidden in caves. Remember, Obadiah fed them. Elijah had to flee into the wilderness. God fed Elijah miraculously. You get to Revelation, it says that during the oppression of this woman for 42 months, God's church goes underground and he feeds her, his church, in the wilderness. Just like he fed Israel in the wilderness. 3.5 years. There's another mother-daughter team. During the time of Christ, you had John the Baptist, who is persecuted by Herodias and her daughter, that danced for Herod, and the one thing she asked for was the death of God's prophet. Isn't that interesting? Same time period. Jesus' ministry, 3.5 years. And so 7 is a perfect number in the Bible. 3.5 is a perfect interruption of his perfect number. It's exactly half of 7. You'll find 3.5 in the Bible usually is a time where there is persecution and oppression and resistance to God's work. During the 3.5 years Jesus taught persecution, he dies at the end of it. The apostles preached to the Jews for another 3.5 years. At the end of that, Stephen is stoned. You got the 3.5 years of Elijah, and he has to run for his life from Jezebel into the wilderness. Right? And so now you've got 3.5 prophetic years, 1,260 days in 3.5 Jewish years. From 538 to 1798, God's church has to flee into the wilderness. They go underground. They're oppressed. They're persecuted. Millions are slain. So history is repeating itself. But it says that beast that was and is not and yet is, it gets a deadly wound, but it comes back. I think we're at that point now where all the world is wondering after the beast. So the message, Babylon. Who is Babylon? Babylon represents fallen Christendom with its head in Rome and her daughters. Is fallen, come out of her. So, can you tell I'm racing? See, I don't get to teach this class next week, and I don't want the other guys to get all the fun, so I'm going to try and cover as much as I can. Babylon represents confusion. It says, what has this woman got in her hand in Revelation 17? She has a golden cup in her hand full of the wine, and it's wine that makes people drunk. It's not grape juice, of her abominations. You know what part of the Protestant Reformation was about? Is reformers like Calvin and Luther, they said the priest does not have the power to turn grape juice into the blood of Christ. And it was also fermented. The bread is supposed to be unleavened in the Last Supper, and the grape juice is supposed to be unfermented. They represent the blood and the body of Jesus. Jesus said, I will drink this with you again, new in my Father's kingdom. That's in Matthew 26 when he has the Last Supper. So, but it now was fermented. I remember going to Catholic services. There I go. People can say, see, he is a Jesuit. When I was a kid, military school, we had to go to, I had to go to a service every Sunday. And my mother was Jewish, so I'd sometimes go to the Jewish services. And my father had been a Baptist, so sometimes I'd go to the Protestant services. But they sent me to Catholic school for a while, so then I went to the Catholic services. I used to go to all three just to mix it up. And I remember going to the Catholic service where the priest had to do several services for the different schedules of the kids. And every time the priest would drink some of the wine. By the third or fourth Mass, he was getting tipsy. And that always struck me. Also struck me he was smoking during the service. While he's doing Mass with us, he was smoking a cigarette. And I always, back then everyone smoked. I always thought that was really strange. But, so the wine, remember Jesus said, don't put new wine in old wineskins. He compared his gospel to the old wine or the new wine? New wine, right? And so Jesus, when he gave the grape juice to the disciples at the Last Supper, it was symbol for the gospel and the blood of Christ, pure. Well, this is something where the teachings of Jesus have been corrupted. What are some examples of things that have been corrupted by the church over the ages? You know, one more thing I might mention. In the Catholic Encyclopedia, it says the chalice, the golden cup, is the most important of the sacred vessels used in their service. Where does it say Jesus had a golden cup? Probably was anything but gold at that dinner. One example would be that the Ten Commandments are not binding. Have you heard that? Can you imagine a pastor standing up in his church and saying you don't have to keep the Ten Commandments or they're optional? 100 years ago, no pastor would say that. It's interesting, just in the last 100 years, you got pastors that say, we're not under the law, we don't have to keep the Ten Commandments. You start asking them if it's okay to break 9 of them, they'll say, of course not. But when the 10th comes up, they say, or when the 4th commandment comes up, they say, oh, no, we're not under the law. So if you're in a church that is teaching you don't have to keep God's law, we don't do it to be saved, but if you love him, you keep his commandments, you're in Babylon. The idea that the first day of the week is holy and not the 7th day, where does that come from in the Bible? Show me a verse. That's one of the, and by the way, Sunday, where does Sunday get its name? From sun worship. And what was the central worship in Babylon and Egypt? It was sun worship. The idea that you die and go right to heaven or hell before the judgment, that doesn't make any sense. That comes from spiritualism. The idea that people die and immediately they're disembodied spirits. And the Bible's pretty clear, the living know they'll die, the dead don't know anything until the resurrection. That's one of the teachings of Babylon. God says to come out of. The idea that Christ's coming is a secret. That's a relatively new teaching, but where is that in the Bible? But isn't that popular today? 100 years ago, pastors never said that. You can go listen to old Billy Graham sermons. I just watched an old black and white Billy Graham sermon. He preaches the second coming as a visible, literal event. The idea that it was a secret sort of began to creep in after Hal Lindsey and the Schofield Bible became popular. Yeah, David. Yeah, the idea that you get grace through partaking in the sacraments. Yeah, that's another example of a doctrine that has corrupted things. The immortality of the soul. Where in the Bible does it say you have an immortal soul? Show me a verse. Yeah, well, Genesis, the devil said, you will not surely die. Yeah, God said, you will die. The devil said, you won't die. Bible tells us God and God only has immortality. When Jesus comes, then this mortal will put on immortality. We don't have it now. We'll just go to a cemetery. You'll see we're not mortal. I mean, we're not immortal. So the immortality of the soul is something that it's a teaching of Babylon. The idea that God is going to torture people through endless ages for the sins of one lifetime. Think about how horrific that is. Can you imagine burning for 10 years? Can you imagine burning for 10 minutes? Don't imagine it. It's a horrific thought. Yeah, and then that's another one. The idea of baptism by sprinkling. Where is that in the Bible? That developed actually. All the Roman Catholics baptized by immersion until about 500 A.D. That happened more slowly than some other things. You can go to the Tower of Pisa. I've been there in Italy, and across the courtyard from the Tower of Pisa is a big church built around a baptistry in Pisa, and they used to baptize by immersion. And so that's just one of the many things that came in. Confessing your sins to a priest. The Bible says confess your faults to one another and pray for one another, but nowhere does it say that you have the power to forgive, that one mortal holds the power to forgive. It says God and God only can forgive sins. So this is just a small sample of some of the wine of Babylon. And so when God says Babylon is fallen, can you see all these false teachings have come in? Now, we learned a few weeks ago when we talked about what happened with the last phase of the church in Laodicea and the beginning of the time of judgment. God began cleansing his church on earth from the false teachings of Babylon. Remember, we read in Daniel 8, the truth was cast to the ground. It wasn't just one truth. It means a whole bunch of truth was cast to the ground. And so this is just an example of some of these things. And then, what's another characteristic of Babylon? A confusion of tongues. Show me where in the Bible you have Jesus babbling in prayer or the apostles babbling in prayer. They accused them of that, and Peter said, we are not drunk, as you suppose. It's only the 9th hour, or 9 o'clock in the morning, is what he said. And every man heard them speak in their own language. The idea that being filled with the Spirit means you start to mutter and babble. And I don't want to be unkind, because I used to go to that church before I ever visited an Adventist church. But I could never find it in the Bible. I used to argue with all my charismatic friends. I said, show me that. I don't see anybody praying in tongues anywhere in the Bible. They said, when Jesus was on the cross and he said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, he was speaking in tongues. I said, no, it's not what it says. He spoke in the same language he spoke every day. They said they misunderstood him because in Aramaic it sounds like this. That's all they were saying. But that was the best answer they could give me. There's no example of anyone praying in tongues in the Bible. Yeah.
Only in the Corinthians, Paul tries, there is a problem with something like that. He tries to correct it by telling them, I'd rather you speak
5 words with your understanding that you might instruct others than 10,000 in an unknown tongue. Yeah, but he never was encouraging them to pray in an unknown tongue.
He just alludes to something.
There was a problem in Corinth exactly right, that he needed to correct. Yeah, but you don't see an example. The 3 examples of speaking in tongues in the Bible is Acts 2, Acts 10, and Acts 19. And in all 3 examples, there's several language groups present, and they're communicating, and you know what they're communicating. Wonderful works of God. It says they were magnifying God, and they prophesied. Those are all things where you'd have to know what was being said to put that down. So this is just a handful of what was happening. Now, What happens if you don't come out of Babylon? The plagues are going to fall on Babylon. Eventually, Babylon is going to be so powerful that Babylon will compel everybody in the world to receive her mark. So you can only have two groups. One will have the seal of God. One will have the mark of the beast. Babylon is very much in confederacy with the kings of the earth and going to use her religious power to force this religious observance. All right, now I've been just rambling all kinds of things about Babylon. This is a quick flyover of a very big teaching. I've shown you where Babylon goes from Genesis to Revelation and several books in between. You know, it's interesting when Peter writes his letter, he says, the church in Babylon greets you. What do you think Peter means by that? Peter wasn't in Babylon, he was in Rome. And Peter says, the church in Babylon greets you. So what was Peter referring to Rome as back in his day? Some say, well, he was talking about a church way over there in Mesopotamia. No, he wasn't. He was using a spiritual term they all understood back then. The same way that ancient Babylon had persecuted the Jewish people, Rome was doing the same thing. And Peter saw that coming. All right, any questions quickly? Yes?
Well, Doug, if you gave this presentation to the Pope tonight, what would he say?
If I gave this presentation to the Pope, what would he say? Well, I'd have to speak Italian or Spanish to do that. But, you know, I've had a little fantasy before. It'd be nice to be able to sit down with him and go over that. It is probably a fantasy that will never be realized. But, you know, you always wonder, is the man, does he have, you know, an honest interest in truth? And if he did and he saw this, it's hard to refute, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
When I heard this, I thought, how can anyone argue with Revelation 17? It is so clear. Question?
Is there a little booklet?
Oh, is there a booklet? Yes. Well, for one thing,
Addresses the passage.
well, everything that I just shared, I probably ought to write a book because it's not all in one book. But, you know, we did mention earlier, we've got this study guide that we'll send you for free. Maybe I forgot to mention it. If you'd like to get the study guide called Bowing to Babylon, then just text the word Babylon, B-A-B-Y-L-O-N. Text that word to 99000, and, you know, there'll be a way for you to order this, and we can send it to you. And it's called Bowing to Babylon. It's a lesson we've got that identifies Babylon. It covers a lot of the details, but not everything. Any other questions on the lesson before we sign off with our friends watching? Yes?
Speaking in tongues, was that Acts 2, 10, and 19?
Speaking in tongues, you'll find in Acts chapter 2, 10 is Cornelius, and Acts 19, there's 12 Ephesian believers. Yes, those are the only three examples of it actually happening. Jesus refers to it in Mark 16. He says, you will speak with other tongues. But they're not doing it at that point. All right, well, thank you very much for coming. I hope we all learned something. There's still a lot left. Maybe some of my associates will be able to pick up the pieces I'm sure I left lying around. And I want to say goodnight, and thank you very much for our friends that are joining us on Facebook.